The penthouse felt as cold and empty as Jonathan Clark's heart. His feet echoed on the marble floors as he paced, his mind tangled in the weight of his own success. The glass walls offered a sweeping view of Manhattan's skyline, a panorama of lights, a city of constant motion. Yet within these walls, time stood still. From his position on the top floor, Jonathan could see the world at his feet, a world that had come to symbolize everything he had worked for, and yet offered little solace. At 50 years old, Jonathan had everything most people could only dream of: wealth, power, a reputation that spanned industries. He was a billionaire, the CEO of a tech empire, respected and admired in the corridors of high-rise buildings and boardrooms. He had everything but the one thing he longed for: the sense of connection that only love could offer. His marriage to Olivia, once filled with passion and shared dreams, had long since become a business arrangement, a partnership that thrived in the public eye, but withered in the private spaces of their lives. As he poured himself a drink, Jonathan's gaze lingered on the glass, a pristine crystal tumbler filled with whiskey, the amber liquid shimmering like a dream that he could never quite grasp. It was a small comfort in a life that had come to feel overwhelmingly large. He was always busy, too busy to stop and reflect on the path he had chosen. But tonight, something about the solitude of the penthouse seemed to demand attention. He ran his fingers through his graying hair, the weight of years in the business world pressing down on him. Each deal, each acquisition had brought him closer to the top, but it had also pushed him farther away from the people he cared about. His thoughts flickered to Olivia, his wife of nearly 2 decades. She was beautiful, elegant, the epitome of grace. She had once been the woman who captured his heart with her laughter and kindness, but now she was a distant figure, more a ghost than a partner. Her life was filled with charity galas, fundraisers, and social obligations, leaving little room for anything else. They shared a bed, a home, but they no longer shared anything that mattered. There was no denying the truth. Jonathan was lonely. And the worst part? He didn't know how to fix it. The sound of the elevator dinging broke his reverie. Jonathan didn't need to look at the clock to know it was her, the woman who still held a piece of his heart, despite everything. Olivia's return had become a predictable rhythm in his life, yet her presence no longer filled the spaces that stretched between them. The spaces that used to be filled with warmth, with shared moments and whispered promises, were now filled with silence. The door opened and Olivia stepped inside, her heels clicking sharply against the floor as she removed her coat. She was stunning, as always, her golden hair cascading over her shoulders, her eyes framed by the elegance of her high-fashion look. But her beauty felt distant, like something he admired from afar, rather than something that once belonged to him. "Jonathan," she said, her voice cool, almost measured. "How was your day?" He didn't answer right away. He knew that whatever he said would ring hollow. She had already heard it all before, the meetings, the numbers, the endless string of accomplishments. The conversation would be perfunctory, a polite exchange between 2 strangers who once knew each other intimately. "Same as always?" he replied, his voice lacking its usual conviction. "How was yours?" "Busy," she answered, pulling a bottle of wine from the cabinet with the ease of someone who had done it countless times. The ritual of her return, her preparation of dinner alone in the kitchen, her life always moving forward while his seemed stuck. He could almost feel the weight of it in his bones. Jonathan sat at the bar, swirling the whiskey in his glass, watching her movements. She never looked up as she worked, always focused on the task at hand, never on him. It was as though he was an afterthought, a fixture in the background of her life. He swallowed the last of his drink and stood, walking over to the window, staring out at the glittering city. For a moment, he thought he saw a reflection of what he once had, a life filled with meaning. But it was a mirage, fading the moment he reached for it. "Olivia," he said suddenly, his voice raw with something he didn't often let surface. "Do you ever wonder if we've missed something?" She paused, setting the wine glass down with care. Her eyes, usually so composed, flickered with something, curiosity, or perhaps a momentary spark of the woman she used to be. "What do you mean?" she asked quietly, her voice softening just enough to suggest that she, too, felt the absence. "We've built this life," he began, gesturing to the opulent space around them, "but somewhere along the way it stopped being about us. About us, Olivia. It's just been about the business, the events, the appearances." His words, raw and unrefined, hung in the air between them. Her silence stretched long enough that Jonathan turned to face her. There was no anger, no defensiveness in her eyes, only a sadness that had quietly settled there over the years. She looked at him, but it wasn't the look of a wife anymore. It was the look of a woman who had long ago made peace with the fact that her husband was, at best, a stranger in her life. "Jonathan," she said, her voice calm, almost resigned, "what exactly do you want from me? After all this time?" He didn't know how to answer. What did he want? He wanted the connection they had lost. He wanted the passion that had once ignited their marriage, the love that had once been effortless. But most of all, he wanted something real, something that couldn't be measured in stock prices or the size of his office. But instead he said nothing. He simply watched her as she poured herself a glass of wine, the silence deepening between them. It was then, in that moment, when he felt the weight of his own choices pressing down on him. He had everything but what mattered most. He couldn't help but wonder, was it too late to change? The next morning, Jonathan found himself wandering the streets of Manhattan, as if the city might offer some answers. He didn't have a destination in mind, just the need to move, to break free from the suffocating silence of the penthouse. The streets were bustling, the world around him brimming with life. Yet Jonathan felt more alone than ever. The weight of his conversation with Olivia lingered in his chest like a dull ache, a reminder of how far they had drifted. He could feel the space between them growing wider with each passing day. And in the midst of it all, he couldn't shake the memory of Grace, the woman he had once loved with such intensity, the woman who had slipped through his fingers when he had chosen the world of power over love. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from his assistant, a simple line of text that caused his heart to stutter for reasons he couldn't quite explain. Grace Adams would like to meet today at 2 p.m. at the Peninsula. The moment he read the name, something in him shifted. Grace, after all these years. He hadn't heard from her since she left New York, took a job in Paris, and built her own empire. When they had parted ways, it had been amicable, at least that's what he had told himself. But deep down, Jonathan knew it had been more than just a matter of distance. He had let her go without truly understanding what she meant to him, too caught up in the demands of his life to notice the loss until it was too late. Now, she was back. The Peninsula Hotel was a haven of elegance, and when Jonathan walked into the lobby, he saw her immediately. Grace sat by the floor-to-ceiling windows, bathed in the soft afternoon light, looking every bit the woman he remembered, only stronger, more poised. Her dark hair was swept back in a sleek bun, and the tailored suit she wore highlighted the sharpness of her profile. She was effortlessly beautiful, but it wasn't her looks that drew him in. It was the same magnetic pull that had always existed between them, the chemistry that neither time nor distance had been able to erase. Grace glanced up as Jonathan approached, a fleeting smile tugging at her lips, though there was something more reserved in her eyes. She stood when he reached her, and for a moment, they simply stared at each other, Two people who had shared a past they both thought was over. "Jonathan," she said softly, her voice still carrying the same warmth that had once made him feel like the most important man in the room. "It's been a long time." He sat down across from her, the air between them thick with unspoken words. "Too long," he replied, his voice lower than usual, as if speaking any louder might shatter the delicate moment they shared. "I didn't expect to hear from you." Grace tilted her head slightly, studying him. "I didn't think I'd reach out either," she said. "But here we are." She took a deep breath, her gaze drifting out the window for a brief moment before returning to him. "I heard about your company's recent developments. Impressive work as always." Jonathan stiffened, his mind quickly turning to business. It was easier to talk about work, easier to discuss numbers and deals than to confront the emotions simmering just below the surface. "Thanks," he said, almost absently. "I've been keeping busy." Grace smiled, but there was something behind it, a flicker of recognition, as if she could see right through him. "I'm not here to talk about business, Jonathan," she said, her tone a touch more serious. "I wanted to talk about us." The words landed between them like a spark, igniting a tension Jonathan hadn't realized he'd been carrying. His heart skipped a beat, his thoughts momentarily scrambled. She wanted to talk about them. He hadn't expected that. "Grace, He started, but she raised a hand to stop him. "I know," she said gently. "I'm not asking for anything. I just think there are things we both need to understand, things we never really got a chance to talk about." Jonathan's breath hitched in his throat, a pang of guilt creeping in. He knew what she was referring to, their breakup all those years ago. It had been messy, though neither of them had ever fully confronted the reasons why it ended. He had let her slip away, consumed by the demands of his career, too selfish to fight for her. "I should have fought for you," he said quietly, the words slipping out before he could stop them. He wasn't sure why he said it, perhaps because it was the truth, or perhaps because he could see that Grace, the one person who had ever truly seen him, was still here, still willing to listen. Grace met his gaze, and for a moment, the years melted away. She looked as if she might say something, but she paused, her lips pressing together in a thin line. "It's not that simple, Jonathan." He leaned forward, his voice urgent. "What do you mean?" "I mean," she said softly, her eyes narrowing with a quiet intensity, "that I'm not the same person I was when we were together. Neither are you. And I think we both need to face that." Jonathan's pulse quickened. There it was, the unspoken truth between them. They had both changed. Grace had built a successful life in Paris, creating something meaningful on her own, while he had become a man whose success had come at the expense of his personal life. A man who, despite having it all, had never truly had her. "I know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not the same man, Grace." The silence stretched between them, charged with the weight of their shared history. Jonathan realized with a jolt that he wasn't just talking about who he had been when they were together. He was talking about who he had become in the years since they had parted. Grace studied him carefully, her eyes searching his face as if looking for a glimmer of the man she once loved. "So, what do you want, Jonathan?" Her voice was steady, but there was a hint of vulnerability beneath her calm exterior. The question hung in the air, heavy and loaded. Jonathan stared at her, unsure how to answer. What did he want? He wanted everything he had lost. He wanted her, the woman who had once made him feel alive. But he knew that would require him to face the truths he had been avoiding for far too long. He wasn't sure if he was ready for that. Not yet. But one thing was certain. His life, the one he had built so carefully around power, wealth, and control, was no longer enough. And Grace had reminded him of that. "Maybe," he said, his voice tinged with both hope and fear. "Maybe I just need to figure out who I really am." Grace nodded, her gaze softening for the briefest of moments. "We all do," she said quietly. And in that moment, Jonathan realized that whatever path lay ahead, whether with Grace or without her, he would have to confront the man he had become before he could find the man he truly wanted to be. Jonathan spent the next few days in a haze, torn between the magnetic pull of Grace and the reality of his life with Olivia. Every moment with Grace felt like a revelation. Each word she spoke seemed to chip away at the carefully constructed walls he had built around himself. But in the silence that followed their meeting, the gravity of what he was doing and what he was about to lose settled like a storm in his chest. He couldn't stop thinking about her, about the way her eyes held his when they spoke, like she was seeing the truth beneath all the layers he'd carefully placed on top of himself, about how her presence had made him feel alive in a way he hadn't in years. Grace had been the woman who saw him, the real him, long before his empire had come to define him. And now, as they stood on the precipice of something unspoken, he was faced with a choice he didn't feel ready to make. But there was no denying the truth anymore. He couldn't pretend that the emptiness in his marriage was just a phase. The coldness between him and Olivia was no longer something he could ignore, something that could be papered over with expensive dinners or gifts that meant nothing. The cracks in their relationship had grown so wide, so deep, that they could no longer be repaired with words alone. He glanced at the clock, the minutes ticking away too quickly. Olivia was due home soon, and he hadn't seen her since their last conversation, where she had quietly retreated into herself. The distance between them had only widened since then. She'd been busy with her charity work, her meetings, her social obligations, the perfect distraction from the truth that they were both avoiding. Jonathan sat at the bar in their living room, swirling the remnants of a scotch in his glass. The silence of the penthouse felt suffocating. He was lost in his thoughts when his phone buzzed, pulling him out of his reverie. "Olivia Clark has sent you a message." He hesitated for a moment before opening it, a knot of dread forming in his stomach. "Can we talk when I get home?" It was a simple message, but its weight was undeniable. Olivia knew. She had to know. His behavior, the late nights, the emotional distance, it had all been too obvious for too long. His heart began to race as he read the message again, hoping there might be something more, something that could offer him a reprieve from the inevitable conversation. But there was nothing. Just the quiet hum of the penthouse around him, and the growing realization that his life was unraveling faster than he could control it. When Olivia walked through the door an hour later, she looked as composed as ever. Her dark hair was pulled back into a sleek ponytail, and she wore a sharp black dress, tailored to perfection. She was the picture of elegance, but Jonathan could see the weariness in her eyes, the exhaustion that came from years of living a life that no longer felt like hers. She had once been the woman who made him feel alive, the woman who challenged him, who laughed with him, who held him close in the quiet hours of the night. But now she was a stranger in his own home. "Jonathan," she said, her voice steady but laced with something he couldn't quite place. She set her purse down on the counter and stepped toward him, her gaze never leaving his. "Olivia," he responded, his voice thick with emotion he wasn't sure how to express. She crossed her arms, her posture stiff as if bracing herself for something. "We need to talk," she said, her words sharp, final. Jonathan felt his pulse quicken, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He nodded slowly, setting his glass aside. "I know. We do." "I know what's been going on," she said, her eyes narrowing slightly. "The late nights, the business trips, the distractions. I've known for a while now, Jonathan. You've been checked out. You've been emotionally distant. I can't keep pretending that everything is fine when it's not." Jonathan swallowed hard. The words she spoke were a slap to his face, but they were also the truth. He had been running from this moment, from the unraveling of his marriage, for months, maybe longer. But the truth was undeniable now. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking slightly. I've been lost, Olivia." She didn't flinch at his apology. Instead, she stepped closer, her expression unreadable. "Lost?" she repeated. "That's what you call it? Jonathan, you've been shutting me out for so long I don't even recognize you anymore. I've tried, you know. I've tried to reach you, to be there for you. But you've been so consumed by your work, by your empire, that I don't even know who you are anymore." Jonathan's throat tightened. She was right. He had been consumed by the very thing he had spent his entire life building, the thing that had kept him distracted from the void inside him. But now, standing face to face with Olivia, he realized that the cost of that empire was far greater than he had ever imagined. "Olivia," he began, his voice softer this time, "I never wanted this. I didn't want to lose you. But I think I've been afraid of facing myself. I've been so focused on the business, on success, that I stopped seeing what really mattered." There was a long silence between them as Olivia stood still, absorbing his words. She didn't look angry, not really. Instead, there was a weariness in her eyes, a quiet sadness that spoke volumes. "I don't know what to do with that, Jonathan," she said after a long pause. "I don't know if I can forgive you. I don't know if I even want to." Jonathan's chest tightened, the weight of her words settling over him like a heavy blanket. He had done this. He had pushed her to this point. And now, he wasn't sure how to fix it. "I don't want to lose you, Olivia," he said, his voice breaking. "But I don't know if I can keep going like this, not without facing the truth." The room fell silent, the air thick with the weight of their unspoken feelings. Olivia's gaze softened, but there was no comfort in it, no reassurance. "You need to figure out who you are, Jonathan," she said quietly. "You need to figure out what you want, because right now I don't think you even know." Her words lingered in the air long after she had turned and walked toward the bedroom, leaving Jonathan standing in the silence of their home. He didn't know what he was supposed to do next, but one thing was certain. He could no longer pretend that everything was fine. His life was crumbling, and the woman he had once loved was slipping through his fingers. And as the silence of the penthouse pressed in on him, Jonathan knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The following week was a blur of sleepless nights and restless days, each moment feeling like a step further into a life he no longer recognized. Jonathan tried to bury himself in work, diving into meetings and negotiations, but his mind was always 2 steps behind, preoccupied with the conversation he'd had with Olivia. Her words lingered in his mind, echoing louder than the ring of the phone or the clicking of his keyboard. He needed to find a way to make things right. But how? His entire identity had been built on this empire, this image of power and success. And yet, in the quiet moments when the noise of the world faded away, he realized that he had nothing left, nothing that truly mattered. Olivia's departure from their marriage had been a slow burn, and now it seemed he was watching it all collapse in front of him. But then there was Grace. Grace had been a part of his past, an unforgettable part, and in the few days since their meeting, she had stayed on his mind like a pull he couldn't escape. There was something about the way she had looked at him, something that made him feel seen in a way he hadn't in years. For the first time in a long time, Jonathan felt the stirrings of hope, the idea that there could be something more, something real. It was late on a Thursday afternoon when his phone buzzed again, pulling him from his thoughts. This time, The message was from Grace, a simple line of text that made his heart skip a beat. "I've been thinking about our conversation. Would you like to meet again? I have something I want to discuss." The words were casual enough, but Jonathan felt the weight behind them. Something was coming. He wasn't sure if it would bring closure or open up a new chapter of confusion, but one thing was certain: he couldn't ignore it. He quickly typed a reply. "Of course. When and where?" The next evening, Jonathan found himself once again walking into the familiar, elegant lobby of the Peninsula. The hotel had always felt like a place of calm, luxury without the harsh edges of the world he usually inhabited. He knew this meeting with Grace would be different. The air was thick with unspoken tension, and he wondered if it would be the beginning of something new or the final chapter of a history they couldn't rewrite. Grace was already there when he arrived, sitting at the same table by the window. The light from the street below cast a soft glow across her face, highlighting the sharpness of her features and the strength that emanated from her. She looked as poised as always, but there was something more vulnerable in her eyes tonight. Her gaze softened when she saw him, but she didn't rise this time. She simply gestured to the seat across from her, inviting him to sit. "Jonathan," she said, her voice warm but guarded. "Thank you for meeting me." "I wouldn't have missed it," he replied, his voice low, steady, but carrying a hint of the nerves he was trying to hide. He had no idea what she wanted to discuss, but whatever it was, he had a sinking feeling it would change everything. She smiled, but the smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "I've been thinking about what you said the other day," she began, "about needing to figure out who you really are. And I've been doing some thinking of my own." Jonathan's heart skipped at the mention of his words. The ones he hadn't even realized had come out so forcefully. The truth had come spilling out in the heat of the moment. And now, here was Grace, holding it up to him like a mirror, forcing him to look at the reflection. "I think," she continued, "that we've both been running from things for a long time. From what we really want, and from who we were when we were together." Jonathan nodded, his chest tightening. "I know," he said, the weight of his own words hitting him harder than he expected. "I've been running from myself for a long time, Grace. My life has been about the business, about the success, and I thought that was enough. But it's not. It hasn't been." She leaned forward slightly, her fingers wrapping around the stem of her wine glass. "Jonathan, I've built my life without you. I've carved out something meaningful for myself, something that stands on its own. I'm not the same person I was when we were together, and I know you're not either." Jonathan stared at her, taken aback by the quiet strength in her voice. Grace had always been independent, but hearing her speak with such clarity made him realize how much she had grown since their time together. She had become someone he admired, not just as a woman, but as a person who had taken charge of her own fate while he had allowed his to be defined by everything outside of him. "Grace," he said, his voice a little strained, "I didn't mean to hurt you back then. I didn't understand what I was doing, what I was choosing. But I've spent all these years thinking about you. I never stopped, even when I told myself I had. You were the one thing that felt real to me." She met his gaze, her eyes searching his face, as if trying to find the sincerity in his words. "I don't think either of us really understood what we were doing back then, Jonathan. We were both so focused on the future, on what we thought we needed, that we lost sight of what we actually had, what we could have had." The air between them crackled with something unspoken, something that neither of them could ignore. Jonathan felt the pull toward her again, that same intensity he had felt when they were together. It was like a magnetic force, drawing him in closer, and for a moment, he forgot about everything else. The broken marriage, the emptiness in his life, the weight of his responsibilities. "I've missed you, Grace," he whispered before he could stop himself. The words hung in the air between them, vulnerable and raw. She blinked, the corners of her mouth twitching into a faint, bittersweet smile. "I've missed you too, Jonathan. But that's not enough anymore." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut, and for a moment, he didn't know what to say. The truth was, he had always wanted Grace back. But now, sitting across from her, seeing the woman she had become, he realized how much they had changed, how much time had passed. "I don't want to repeat the past," she said softly, her voice tinged with regret. "I can't go back to what we were, no matter how much I care for you. I need something real, something more than just memories." Jonathan felt the weight of her words settle over him, his heart sinking as the realization struck. She wasn't just talking about their relationship. She was talking about him, about who he had become. "I understand," he said quietly, the truth settling like a cold stone in his chest. "But I don't know who I am without you, Grace." Her eyes softened, and for the first time since their reunion, there was no distance between them. She reached across the table, her hand brushing his, offering him a fleeting moment of comfort. "You'll figure it out, Jonathan," she said, her voice gentle, almost tender. "But you have to do it on your own." The finality of her words hung in the air, and Jonathan knew that he had just taken the first step toward understanding who he really was. And the road ahead would be a long one he would have to walk alone. The days that followed the meeting with Grace were filled with a tension Jonathan couldn't quite shake. He had hoped for some kind of clarity, for a decision to emerge that would tell him where his life should go next. But instead, he found himself lost in the murky waters of his own thoughts. Grace's words echoed in his mind. "You have to figure it out on your own." That statement was both a challenge and a wake-up call, but more than anything, it left him with an unsettling sense of inadequacy. What did she mean? "You'll figure it out on your own." He had spent the last 2 decades building an empire. He had spent years climbing corporate ladders, accumulating wealth and status, but it was all so hollow now. The truth of his life was beginning to settle into his bones like a cold draft. His marriage was faltering. The woman who had once meant everything to him, Olivia, now stood at a distance he couldn't bridge. And Grace, the woman he had never truly let go of, was offering him nothing more than a lesson in self-discovery. Jonathan had thought he understood what it meant to succeed. He had thought power and control were the answers. But now, he realized how little he had truly understood about himself, his desires, and what he needed. The realization hit him harder than any business deal ever had. He had been so focused on the world outside, so consumed by the metrics of success, that he hadn't taken the time to ask himself what truly made him feel alive. What truly made him happy? It was a late evening when Olivia returned home, and Jonathan knew the time had come to face her. They hadn't spoken much since their last confrontation, and the silence between them had grown heavy, suffocating. The distance between them was no longer just physical. It was emotional, a chasm that neither of them seemed willing to cross. But Jonathan was no longer content to simply exist in the quiet spaces of their marriage. He had to confront the truth, not just for her, but for himself. As he heard the familiar sound of the door opening, his heart thudded against his ribs. Olivia walked in, her heels clicking on the marble floor, her posture poised as always, but there was something different in the way she held herself tonight. She was tense, almost guarded, as though she had braced herself for the inevitable. "Jonathan," she said, her voice cool but not without a trace of fatigue. "We need to talk." He nodded, standing up from his place at the bar. "We do," he agreed, his voice tight. The words had been coming to him all day, but now that the moment was here, they seemed to falter, as though they weren't quite enough to bridge the distance between them. Olivia placed her bag down and slowly walked toward him, her gaze steady, but her expression unreadable. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice softer than usual, "about everything, about us." Jonathan swallowed hard, the knot in his stomach growing. "I've been thinking too," he said, his voice laced with a mix of guilt and frustration. "And I'm sorry, Olivia. I know I've been distant. I know I haven't been present, but I've been lost. I thought I could fix it all with work, with success, but I was wrong." She sighed, and for a moment, Jonathan thought she might turn away, might leave the conversation hanging, as she had done before. But instead she looked at him with a kind of quiet sadness that made his chest tighten. "You can't fix everything with work, Jonathan," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You've been using it as a shield, as an excuse. And I've been pretending that it was enough, that we were enough. But we're not, are we? Not anymore." Her words struck him like a punch to the gut. He had known this deep down. He had known that Olivia had been silently retreating, closing off parts of herself. But hearing it, seeing the pain in her eyes as she said it aloud, shattered something inside him. "I've failed you," Jonathan said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. He took a step toward her, his heart racing. "I know I've failed you, and I don't know how to make it right, but I can't keep pretending that I haven't." Olivia didn't flinch. She didn't step back. Instead, she took a deep breath and nodded slowly. "I don't know if you can, Jonathan. I don't know if we can ever go back to what we had. The person you are now, I don't recognize him." The words were a knife in his chest, but they were also the truth. The person he was now had been forged in the fires of ambition and success, and somewhere along the way he had left behind the man who had once laughed with Olivia late at night, who had dreamed of a life built on love, not just power. "I've changed, Olivia," he said, his voice raw. "I know I have, and I don't expect you to forgive me right away, or ever, maybe. But I need to do something different. I need to find out who I am without all of this." He gestured around the room, around the wealth, the cold luxury of their home, the walls that had once made them feel safe, but now only made them feel more alone. Her gaze softened, and for a moment he saw a flicker of the woman he had married, the woman who had believed in him, in them. But the moment passed quickly, and she took a step back, her arms folding across her chest, as if bracing herself once more. "Jonathan," she said quietly, "I think you need to figure that out. I think you need to find that man before you can figure out what you want from me, from us." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Jonathan felt as though the ground beneath him had shifted, like a door he hadn't even realized was closed had been locked shut. "I'm not asking for anything, Jonathan," Olivia continued, her voice gentle but firm. "I'm not asking for you to fix this. I just need space. I need to think about what comes next." Jonathan nodded, though the weight of her words settled on him like a heavy burden. She needed space. And maybe, just maybe, he needed it too. The silence stretched between them, and Jonathan knew in that moment that he had reached a crossroads. He could keep chasing the idea of success, the security of wealth, and continue to live in a marriage of convenience, or he could face the truth of who he had become, confront the man he had lost, and rebuild his life, starting with himself. He couldn't escape the feeling that he had already made the first choice, though it wasn't the easy one. It was the choice to confront his mistakes, to take the painful steps toward change, even if it meant losing everything he had known. As Olivia turned and walked to their bedroom, leaving him standing in the hallway, Jonathan realized that the path he was on had already been set, and now it was up to him to find the courage to walk it. The days that followed the confrontation with Olivia were a blur of restless sleep and long, uncertain moments. Jonathan moved through his life like someone else, like a man caught between two worlds, one he no longer recognized and one that felt unreachable. The penthouse, once a sanctuary of success, now felt more like a gilded cage. His meetings, his endless phone calls, his emails, they all seemed so trivial, like pieces of a life that no longer fit together. He had promised Olivia that he would change, that he would find himself again. But how? What did it even mean to find himself when everything he had built, his empire, his wealth, his identity, had been constructed on a foundation of emptiness? It was Grace's face that haunted him in the quiet hours, her words that echoed in his mind. You have to figure it out on your own. It was the hardest truth he'd ever faced. She was right. He needed to step away from the trappings of success and confront the man he had become, not the man he thought he should be. But with Olivia pulling away, and Grace no longer an option, at least not in the way he wanted, he was left with nothing but his own reflection in the mirror. Jonathan stood by the window, watching the city below. The streets of Manhattan were alive, a never-ending flow of movement, while he remained still, adrift in a life that felt too small for the man he was trying to become. His phone buzzed again, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a text from his assistant. Reminder, dinner with potential investors at 7 p.m. He sighed, a heavy weight pressing down on his chest. The meetings, the deals, he couldn't avoid them. Not yet. He was still trapped in the role of a businessman, still stuck in the persona he had so carefully crafted. But as he stared at the screen, he realized how much he resented it all. The wealth, the power, the respect. It was all just noise. What did it matter if no one truly saw him? What did it matter if he was just another faceless CEO, a man defined by his bottom line and not his heart? With a heavy heart, Jonathan responded to the message, confirming his attendance, though his mind was far from the dinner. The evening arrived, and Jonathan found himself sitting at a lavish table in one of New York's most exclusive restaurants, surrounded by potential investors eager to hear about his latest projects. The conversation flowed smoothly, as it always did in these circles, but Jonathan couldn't bring himself to care. His words were practiced, his smile rehearsed, but inside, he was miles away. He glanced at the menu in front of him, his eyes skimming over the items, but none of it seemed to matter. His mind kept drifting back to the conversation with Olivia, to the soft, sorrowful look in her eyes when she had told him she needed space. It wasn't just that he had failed her. He had failed himself too. "Jonathan, are you with us?" A voice pulled him out of his reverie. He blinked, realizing that one of the investors, a man named Richard, had addressed him. Jonathan quickly adjusted his posture, trying to refocus. "Sorry, just thinking about the figures," he lied, offering a small smile. "I'm here. Go ahead." Richard nodded, but Jonathan's thoughts were already elsewhere. His gaze flickered across the room to the entrance, where the doors opened and a figure stepped in. Grace. His breath caught in his throat, his heart skipping a beat. She looked even more striking than he remembered, her dark hair framing her face, her confident, purposeful stride unmistakable. She was with a colleague, but her eyes scanned the room, and when they landed on him, there was no mistaking the recognition. Grace, for a brief moment, seemed to hesitate. She was already committed to a conversation with the colleague, but her eyes lingered on Jonathan, and something in that look, a mixture of surprise and something else, something softer, made his heart race. Richard continued speaking, but Jonathan wasn't listening anymore. His mind was consumed by the presence of the woman who had once meant so much to him. Grace's arrival was not just an unexpected coincidence. It was a sign, a reminder that his past wasn't so easily left behind. For a moment, Jonathan thought about excusing himself from the table, about walking over to Grace and finally acknowledging the connection that had never truly faded. But what would that accomplish? He couldn't even repair things with Olivia. Was he really ready to open another door, to invite more complications into his life? As Grace's conversation with her colleague ended, she made her way toward the bar. Jonathan knew she would leave soon. That was the kind of woman she was, always in control, always moving forward. But Jonathan couldn't stay seated any longer. He excused himself from the table, murmuring something about checking on the kitchen, and made his way toward the bar. The distance between them felt too far, yet it also felt like a chasm he could never cross. When he reached the bar, Grace was just finishing her drink, her back to him. She was always poised, always elegant. It was something he had loved about her, the quiet confidence, the strength she exuded even in silence. "Grace," he said softly. And when she turned to face him, her eyes widened in surprise, followed by a flicker of recognition. "Jonathan," she said, her voice a little warmer than he had expected. She smiled faintly, the kind of smile that was both guarded and inviting. "I didn't expect to see you here." Jonathan couldn't stop himself from smiling back, despite the storm of emotions that raged inside him. "Neither did I," he replied, his voice low. There was a long pause between them, the kind of silence that stretched too long. He could feel the weight of their shared history in the air, the history that neither of them had fully addressed. The pull between them was palpable, but so was the uncertainty. "Are you still planning to leave tonight?" he asked, his voice betraying a hint of something more, something deeper. Grace's gaze softened, but there was a sadness there now, something he couldn't quite decipher. She shook her head slowly. "I think I'm already gone, Jonathan," she said quietly. His heart sank. Gone. She was gone. Not physically, but emotionally. And he realized in that moment that he had no claim over her anymore. Not in the way he had once hoped. "You've always been the one who was strong enough to walk away," he said, his words raw. "I admire that about you." Grace's eyes flickered with something, regret perhaps, or understanding, but she didn't speak for a long while. When she did, her voice was soft, almost a whisper. "I think we both need to walk away, Jonathan. Not from each other, but from the people we've become." The truth of her words hit him hard. It wasn't just his marriage that needed fixing. It wasn't just his relationship with Grace. It was him, the man he had allowed himself to become. The man he wasn't sure how to leave behind. The silence between them grew thicker, but this time it wasn't uncomfortable. It was understanding. And in that silence, Jonathan knew that his life was about to change forever. But whether it would be for better or worse, he couldn't say just yet. He watched Grace turn, her heels clicking softly as she walked away, her figure disappearing into the crowd. And for the first time in a long time, Jonathan felt a quiet resolve settle over him. The days after the dinner with Grace passed in a blur, each one blending into the next. Jonathan's life had become a strange dance of moving through the motions without ever really living. He had once believed that wealth, power, and status were the things that defined him, things that could fill the emptiness. But now, he felt like an outsider in his own life, standing on the edge of a precipice, unsure whether to jump or turn back. Grace's words haunted him still. We both need to walk away from the people we've become. He had spent years building an identity around his wealth, around his role as a businessman, a CEO, a figure of power. But that man, that persona, felt like a stranger now, a hollow version of the man he used to be, a man who had once loved deeply, lived fully, and believed in the power of connection. He had sacrificed that for success. He had sacrificed it for the promise of security, and now nothing felt secure anymore. His phone buzzed on the kitchen counter, breaking the quiet that had settled around him. He glanced at the screen, then picked it up, his heart sinking at the sight of the message. Olivia. Can we talk tonight? Jonathan's breath caught in his throat. For days now they had barely spoken, just polite exchanges about logistics and the quiet, careful space they had both created between them. The last conversation they'd had hung over him like a storm cloud, and now it seemed Olivia was ready to confront him again, ready to push him toward the decision he had been avoiding. He typed a quick reply. Of course. 7 p.m. Then, as he set the phone down, he felt the familiar ache of dread rise in his chest. It wasn't just about Olivia anymore. It wasn't just about his marriage. It was about everything. The choices he had made, the people he had hurt, and the man he had allowed himself to become. The night arrived slowly, the minutes stretching out as he sat in the dim light of their living room. He wasn't sure what Olivia wanted to say, but he knew whatever it was would change things. It had to. When the clock finally hit 7, the sound of the door opening interrupted his thoughts. Olivia stepped in, her silhouette framed by the soft light of the hallway. She looked just as beautiful as ever, her poise as flawless as it had always been. But there was something different about her tonight. Something softer, perhaps, but more distant, too. She wasn't the woman he had once known, and neither was he. "Jonathan," she said, her voice even, but with an edge he hadn't expected. "We need to have a serious conversation." He nodded, his throat tight. "I know," he said quietly. "I've been avoiding it, but I know we can't keep living like this." She looked at him then, her gaze sharp but pained. "I've been thinking a lot, Jonathan. About us. About what you said, and about what I've been feeling. And I can't keep pretending everything is fine. I need you to understand that." Jonathan stood and crossed the room, meeting her gaze. There was no use in pretending anymore. No use in hiding behind his empire or his success. He was just a man standing in front of the woman he had once promised the world to. And now he was offering her nothing but broken promises. "I don't know if I can fix this, Olivia," he admitted, his voice raw. "I don't even know if I'm the man I used to be, but I'm trying. I want to try." She shook her head slightly, the softness in her eyes replaced by something harder. "You're not the man you used to be," she said, her voice steady but full of sorrow. "And I'm not the woman I used to be either. I've changed, Jonathan. I've had to. I've been trying to hold everything together, but I can't do it anymore. Not if you're not truly here." His chest tightened. He had known this, of course. He had known that Olivia was already emotionally distant, already pulling away. But hearing her say it aloud with such finality made the weight of her words hit him like a fist. "I can't live like this anymore," Olivia continued. "We're both standing in a place where nothing is real. Not the business, not our marriage, not even the life we've built together. We've built walls around each other, and I think it's time to take them down. Not to fix it, but to let it go." The finality of her words hung in the air, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Jonathan felt his own heart crack open. "Olivia," he said, stepping closer, his voice trembling with emotion. "I don't want to lose you, but I don't know how to fix this. I don't know if I can be the man you need me to be." She didn't step back, but her gaze softened, just a fraction. "Maybe it's not about fixing it, Jonathan. Maybe it's about accepting what we've become, about facing the truth. I don't know who I am in this marriage anymore, and I don't think you do either." There was a long silence between them, the weight of her words sinking deep into Jonathan's chest. He had always thought that if he just worked hard enough, if he just gave more of himself to the business, to his success, everything else would fall into place. But it hadn't. And now, standing here with Olivia, he realized how much he had been hiding from, how much he had been running from. "I'm sorry," Jonathan whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm so sorry for everything." She nodded slowly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I know you are," she said softly. "But we can't go back to what we were. I need space, Jonathan, not just from you, but from everything." The words hit him like a blow, but he couldn't deny the truth in them. They couldn't go back. Not to the way things had been. They both needed to change, to grow, and maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to move forward separately. "I understand," Jonathan said quietly, his voice cracking. "If this is what you need, then I'll respect it. I don't want to keep holding on to something that isn't real anymore." Olivia took a step back, her shoulders tense. "I think we both need to let go, Jonathan. Not just of each other, but of the lives we thought we were supposed to have." With those words, Olivia turned and walked away, leaving Jonathan standing alone in the dim light of their living room. The silence was deafening, and yet, for the first time in a long time, he felt like he could breathe. Jonathan stared at the empty space Olivia had left behind, his heart a tangled mess of regret and yearning. The room, once filled with the shared warmth of their marriage, now felt like an echo of what could have been. She had spoken her truth, her words heavy with the weight of finality. And now, for the first time in a long while, Jonathan had no answers, no easy way out. He sank into the armchair by the window, his fingers running through his hair as he tried to make sense of it all. Olivia was right. They had both become strangers to each other, lost in their own lives, consumed by their separate worlds. But it wasn't just her absence that tore at him. It was the loss of himself, the loss of the man he had once been, the man who had known how to love with his whole heart, not just with his ambitions. Grace's words echoed in his mind again, unbidden. "We both need to walk away from the people we've become." And now, with Olivia gone, at least emotionally, Jonathan had no choice but to confront that truth. Who was he really? Who had he become over the years of chasing success, of building an empire that had turned out to be nothing more than a prison? The next few days were a blur of meetings and empty conversations. Jonathan went through the motions, answering calls, attending board meetings, and responding to emails, but nothing seemed to matter. He had a sinking feeling that the life he had so carefully constructed was crumbling beneath him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. He had tried to cling to the business, to the deals, to the wealth that had defined him for so long. But the more he tried, the more he felt the distance between himself and the life he thought he wanted. He could no longer find satisfaction in the numbers, the accolades, or the power. It all felt meaningless now. One evening, after another grueling day of pushing papers and pretending to be the man everyone expected him to be, Jonathan found himself standing in front of the large windows in his penthouse once again, staring out at the sprawling city below. The lights of Manhattan flickered like stars, each one representing a life, a dream, a story. And yet, as he watched, Jonathan felt more isolated than ever. His phone buzzed in his pocket, snapping him out of his reverie. The name on the screen made his pulse quicken. Grace. His heart skipped a beat. The weight of everything he had been avoiding, all the uncertainty of the past weeks, seemed to settle onto him at once. What could she want now? She had walked away that night with finality in her voice, as though they both knew there was no going back. And yet here she was, reaching out to him. He hesitated for only a moment before answering. "Grace," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Jonathan," she replied, her voice soft but steady. "I've been thinking about our conversation, about everything. I think we need to talk. Can we meet tomorrow?" Her words were calm, measured, but there was an undercurrent of something unspoken, a longing, a question, maybe even a glimmer of hope. Jonathan's chest tightened at the thought of seeing her again. He wasn't sure what he expected from this meeting, but he knew he couldn't let it pass by without answering it. "I'd like that," he said, his voice quieter than he intended. "Where?" The next afternoon, Jonathan found himself once again sitting across from Grace, this time in a quiet cafe tucked away in the heart of the city. It was a far cry from the grand venues they had once frequented together, and Jonathan appreciated the simplicity of it. No distractions, no formalities, just two people sitting across from each other, dealing with the weight of their shared history. Grace was as beautiful as ever, her hair pulled back in a messy bun, her eyes soft with something unreadable. She had always exuded an effortless charm, a quiet confidence that made it impossible to ignore her presence. But today there was something different about her. She wasn't just the woman who had once been his lover. She was someone who had moved on, someone who had built a life without him. "I didn't expect to hear from you," Jonathan began, his voice thick with the admission. Grace smiled faintly, but there was no warmth in it. "I didn't expect to reach out either, but I've been thinking a lot about everything we said and what we both need." Jonathan studied her, his heart in his throat. The distance between them was palpable, but there was also something else. A pull, a connection that hadn't faded. Not completely. "What do you think we need?" Jonathan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He was afraid to ask, but he couldn't help himself. Grace took a deep breath, her eyes meeting his with a vulnerability he hadn't seen in years. "I think we both need to face the truth," she said softly. "The truth about who we've become, and the truth about what we've lost. We've both been running from something, Jonathan. From what we really want, from what we really need." Jonathan's heart skipped. Her words felt like a balm to the wounds he had been carrying, yet they also stung with the sharpness of recognition. She was right. They had both been running. Running from each other, from themselves, from the life they had shared. "I've been running for so long," Jonathan admitted, his voice cracking slightly. "I thought if I just kept going, if I kept pushing myself, building this empire, I'd figure it out. But now I don't even know who I am anymore." Grace's gaze softened, and for a moment, Jonathan saw a flicker of the woman he had once loved. But there was no illusion in her eyes now, only clarity. She had found her own path, her own way forward, and he was still searching for his. "I think," Grace said quietly, "you've been hiding behind the idea of success for so long, Jonathan, that you've forgotten how to be real. You've forgotten how to feel." The truth of her words hit him like a punch to the gut. He had hidden behind his wealth, his power, his status, believing that those things could define him, could fill the emptiness inside. But they never had. They never could. "I don't know if I can fix what's broken," Jonathan said, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't know if I can fix us." Grace nodded slowly, her eyes filled with understanding. "You don't need to fix it, Jonathan. You just need to be." The words hung in the air between them, charged with meaning. Jonathan felt the weight of them, the realization that he had spent so much of his life running, so much of his life pretending. And now, for the first time, he felt the smallest inkling of what it might mean to stop, just stop, and finally be honest with himself. "Maybe that's all I've ever needed," Jonathan said softly, more to himself than to Grace. "To just be." Grace's smile was small, but there was something tender in it, something hopeful. "Maybe," she said quietly. For a long moment, they simply sat in the quiet, the weight of their shared history hanging between them. Jonathan knew that nothing would ever be the same. And though he didn't have all the answers, he knew one thing for certain. The road ahead would be one of self-discovery, of healing, and perhaps of finding his way back to the man he had always been beneath the weight of success. And maybe, just maybe, there was still room for grace in that journey. Jonathan walked back to his penthouse that evening, feeling both lighter and more burdened than he had in months. Grace's words had struck him deeply, perhaps more so than he was ready to admit. He had lived his life running from his feelings, from the man he used to be, from the woman he used to love. But in that quiet conversation with Grace, for the first time in years, he had allowed himself to truly face the truth. He had been hiding for far too long, not just from Olivia, not just from Grace, but from himself. The weight of his actions over the years hung heavily on his chest. The missed opportunities, the moments he could have fought for love instead of power, for connection instead of success. But now, with Grace standing before him a shadow of what once was, Jonathan realized that the damage had been done. He could no longer undo the mistakes of the past. His thoughts turned to Olivia. As much as he had tried to bury his feelings for her, as much as he had convinced himself that their marriage had died a slow death long ago, he knew he couldn't pretend anymore. She had been his rock, his partner, and yet he had failed her in ways that were irreparable. The truth was, the more he tried to repair things with Olivia, the more he understood that their love had been poisoned by years of emotional neglect, by a failure to nurture the bond they had once shared. It was late when he arrived home, the city outside glowing with the false warmth of a place that never truly rested. The apartment was quiet, too quiet, and the silence felt suffocating as he stepped inside. He had come back to an empty house more times than he cared to count, but tonight the silence felt different. It felt like the beginning of something. He didn't expect to find Olivia sitting on the couch when he entered, but there she was. Her posture was rigid, her eyes red-rimmed, as though she had been waiting for him, perhaps for longer than either of them realized. The distance between them had never felt wider, and yet in the dim light of their living room, Jonathan felt the weight of the moment settle over him like a storm. She looked up as he stepped into the room, her gaze intense but guarded. "Jonathan," she said, her voice soft but firm. "We need to talk." He swallowed hard, his throat tight with the tension that had been building for days. "I know," he replied, his voice strained. He didn't sit down. He couldn't. He didn't feel like he belonged in this space anymore, this house that had once been filled with laughter, with shared dreams, now cold and distant. Olivia's eyes searched his face, as though trying to find something she could trust again. "I've been thinking, Jonathan, about everything." Her voice faltered slightly as she spoke, but she quickly steadied herself, her gaze unwavering. "I'm not sure I even know who you are anymore." Her words cut through him like a blade. "Olivia," he whispered, stepping toward her. "I know I've hurt you. I know I've failed you, and I can't take that back. But I need you to understand that I'm trying. I'm trying to figure out who I am, without the business, without all the things I thought mattered." Olivia looked at him for a long moment, her lips pressed tightly together, before she finally spoke again, her voice quiet but firm. "I'm not asking you to fix it, Jonathan. I'm asking you to be honest, to be real. And for once, I need you to stop running." Jonathan's heart pounded in his chest. He could feel the weight of her words, the depth of the pain they carried. For years he had run, from her, from the reality of their marriage, from the man he had become. And now, She was asking him to stop, to face it all, head on, and confront the truth of their love, or what was left of it. "I don't know if I can," he admitted, his voice breaking slightly. "But I'm trying, Olivia. I can't be the man you need me to be, not yet. But I'll try to become the man I need to be. For myself, and maybe for us, too." Her eyes softened just a little, but the walls between them were still there, tall and unyielding. "I need you to want that, Jonathan," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need you to want to be real again, because I don't think I can keep waiting for someone who isn't here." The silence that followed felt suffocating. Jonathan knew she was right. He wasn't really here, not in the way she needed him to be. He had been physically present for years, but emotionally distant, always chasing the next deal, the next success. But in chasing those things, he had left her behind, and he had left himself behind. "Olivia," he said, his voice trembling now, "I'm not asking you to wait for me. But I'm asking for a chance to figure this out. I don't want to lose you, but I can't promise I'll have all the answers." She looked at him for a long time, her eyes filled with a sadness he couldn't fully understand. She had given so much of herself to their marriage, to their life together. And now, it seemed, she was beginning to give up on it. "I don't know if we can fix this, Jonathan," she said, her voice quiet. "But I can't keep pretending like we can go back to what we were. I need something real, something that doesn't come with all the lies we've told ourselves over the years." Jonathan swallowed hard, his chest aching as the words settled between them. He had known, deep down, that this was coming, that the person he had become, the person he had allowed himself to be, wasn't someone Olivia could continue loving. He had failed her in ways he couldn't undo, and now he was left standing in the wreckage of his own choices. "I understand," he whispered, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "I understand." The silence that followed was deafening. There was no easy resolution, no promises they could make to undo the years of emotional neglect. But there was an unspoken understanding between them now. Jonathan could no longer pretend that everything was fine, and neither could Olivia. As she stood and walked toward the bedroom, Jonathan felt the weight of the moment settle over him. He had reached the end of one chapter, and though he didn't know what the next one would bring, he knew it wouldn't be easy. There would be no magic fix, no quick solutions, only the long, painful road of self-discovery and perhaps eventual redemption. And as the door to the bedroom clicked softly shut behind her, Jonathan realized something deep within him. Maybe, just maybe, the hardest part of this journey wasn't facing Olivia. It was facing the man he had become, the man who had lost himself in the pursuit of everything but the one thing that truly mattered. And now, as the silence of the apartment enveloped him, Jonathan knew that his path forward would require more than just love. It would require a complete reinvention of who he was and what he stood for. The days after his conversation with Olivia had been like a blur, each one passing in a haze of confusion, self-doubt, and the kind of loneliness that felt like it would swallow him whole. Jonathan had been waking up each morning with the hollow ache of regret, not just for what he had lost, but for the man he had become. He spent most of the week avoiding the office, delegating everything he could to his team. He no longer had the appetite for meetings, for endless deals and boardroom politics. It all felt meaningless in the face of what he was truly losing. Olivia's words had cut deeper than anything in the business world ever could. He needed to face the reality that his life was slipping away piece by piece, and it was his own doing. At the same time, he couldn't shake the thought of Grace. The conversation they'd had, the quiet truth that had passed between them, it hadn't left him. She had given him an opening, a chance to confront his flaws, to begin a journey toward understanding. But he also knew that Grace was not a fix for everything that was broken. She couldn't be. Not anymore. Grace had moved on, and he couldn't help but wonder if he could ever move on from the ghost of their past. What they had, what he had been so willing to throw away, seemed like an impossible dream now. But there was something that tugged at him, something unresolved, something he needed to know, if only to quiet the echo of their time together in his mind. It was late on a Thursday evening when Jonathan found himself walking the familiar streets of Manhattan, the weight of his thoughts carrying him with a purpose he couldn't quite articulate. He had called Grace earlier, asking if she could meet. She had agreed, though her response had been measured. She was no longer the woman he had once known, the carefree, spontaneous partner he had once believed would be his forever. No, Grace had grown. She was someone else now, someone who had learned to stand on her own. And Jonathan was about to face the consequences of his own choices, the choices that had brought them both to this place. As he entered the cafe they had agreed to meet in, he saw Grace already seated in a corner. The soft glow of the dim lighting framed her face, and for a moment it felt like nothing had changed. But as he approached, he saw the guarded look in her eyes, the way she studied him, almost as if she were trying to measure how much of the man she had once loved still remained. "Jonathan," she greeted him, her voice calm but laced with something that was hard to pinpoint. "Grace," he replied, his voice tight. He sat down across from her, the weight of the conversation pressing on him. There was so much to say, but the words felt too heavy to form. He had been carrying the guilt of his actions, the choices that had led to this broken version of himself, and now, sitting across from Grace, he couldn't help but wonder if it was too late. She didn't say anything for a moment, just studied him with an expression that seemed a mixture of sadness and understanding. "I wasn't sure you would reach out again," she said finally, breaking the silence. "I thought you had made your choice." Jonathan swallowed hard. "I thought I had too," he said quietly. "But the truth is, Grace, I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do anymore. I don't know who I am without everything I've built." Grace nodded slowly, her expression softening. "I know. I can see it, Jonathan. You've been lost in the life you created, and now it feels like everything is falling apart. But it doesn't have to be like this." Jonathan leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the table, the reality of his situation settling in with every word she spoke. "How do you do it, Grace?" he asked, his voice a whisper. "How do you stay grounded when everything around you is chaos? How do you move forward when you've already given so much?" She looked at him, her gaze steady, but not without a touch of pain. "I moved forward because I had to. I had to face the truth about who I was becoming. I couldn't keep living in the shadow of what we had, of what you and I thought we could build together. I had to make my own way, Jonathan, and you have to do that too." The words hit him like a thunderclap. You have to make your own way. For so long he had believed that his success defined him, that his empire was all he had left. But in that moment, he realized that all the money in the world couldn't fix what was broken inside of him. It couldn't fix his marriage. It couldn't fix the part of himself that had been lost in the pursuit of wealth. "Is it too late, Grace?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "For me? For us?" Grace's expression softened, but her eyes were steady. "It's never too late to change, Jonathan. But you have to want it. You have to want to face the truth about yourself, about what you've lost, and who you really are beneath it all. But no one can make that decision for you. Not even me." Jonathan closed his eyes for a moment, the weight of her words sinking in. He could feel the heavy responsibility of his choices bearing down on him. But he also knew that he couldn't stay in this place of indecision forever. He had to make a choice. He had to decide who he wanted to be, not just for Olivia or for Grace, but for himself. When he opened his eyes again, Grace was still watching him, her gaze soft but unwavering. "I've been running, Grace," Jonathan said, his voice raw. "Running from my mistakes, from the man I've become. I didn't know how to stop, but I'm ready to try, to change, to be someone I can live with again." She nodded, a small, almost imperceptible smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "Then that's the first step. But remember, it's not about fixing what's broken. It's about rebuilding something new, something real." Jonathan sat back, letting out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. For the first time in what felt like forever, he felt like he was on the edge of something. He wasn't sure what it was, but it was the first real glimmer of hope he'd had in a long time. "Thank you," he said, his voice quiet, "for helping me see that." Grace smiled, a genuine warm smile. "I'm not doing it for you, Jonathan. I'm doing it for me, and for you too, but mostly for you." As the conversation continued, the heaviness that had weighed on Jonathan's chest for so long seemed to lift, just a little. It wasn't the resolution he had hoped for, but it was a start, a step in the right direction. And as he walked out of the cafe later that night, he realized that change wasn't something that happened overnight, but it was something he could finally begin to embrace. Jonathan spent the following week lost in a whirlwind of self-reflection, his days a blur of long walks through the city, phone calls to his team that felt detached and distant, and countless moments spent staring at the skyline from his apartment window, lost in thought. He was no longer the man who had so easily embraced power and control. No, the man who had once lived and breathed the luxury of wealth and success had been replaced by someone unrecognizable, someone uncertain of who he truly was, or what he truly wanted. But the one thing that he was certain of was the deep ache of regret that gnawed at him, a regret that wasn't just for what he had lost. Olivia, his marriage, the life he had once promised her, but also for the man he had allowed himself to become. Grace had helped him see that. She had held up a mirror to his soul, forced him to confront the truth about his choices. But even now, with those truths laid bare, Jonathan still felt the weight of them. The road ahead was no longer about wealth or status. It was about redemption. And the only person who could grant him that was Olivia. That evening, after another long, grueling day of introspection, Jonathan found himself standing in front of the door to Olivia's office in their shared apartment. The door, once a place of quiet refuge for both of them, now felt like an impenetrable barrier, one that divided them in a way that words couldn't fix. Jonathan hadn't seen her much over the past week. She had kept her distance, and he had respected that. But now the time had come. He needed to face her. He knocked once, then waited. His pulse quickened as he heard the soft shuffle of her footsteps approaching. "Come in," she called softly. Jonathan opened the door, his breath caught in his throat as he saw her sitting at her desk, a faint smile on her lips that didn't quite reach her eyes. She looked tired, physically, emotionally drained, and Jonathan couldn't help but feel the weight of their shared history pressing down on him. "Olivia," he began, his voice hoarse, "can we talk?" She nodded, her gaze never leaving his face. "Of course. I think we've both been avoiding this conversation long enough, don't you think?" He walked into the room and took a seat across from her, his hands clasped tightly together. There was a chasm between them now, one that words could no longer bridge. He had failed her, failed himself, and there was no easy way to erase that. "I know I've hurt you," Jonathan said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I've hurt you in ways I can't undo, and I can't ask for your forgiveness. Not yet, anyway. But I need you to know that I'm trying. I'm trying to be a better man, Olivia. She looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face, as if trying to find something she could trust, something she could believe in. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft but firm. You've said that before, Jonathan. You've promised to change, to be better, and I want to believe you. But I don't know if I can keep waiting for you to be someone else. Jonathan's heart sank at her words. The distance between them felt like an insurmountable mountain. The cracks in their marriage had deepened so far that he wasn't sure how they could ever be repaired. But he couldn't give up. Not yet. Not when he finally understood the price of his actions, the cost of his neglect. I don't expect you to trust me right away, he said, his voice raw. I don't deserve your trust, not yet. But I need you to know that I'm working on myself, Olivia. I'm trying to be someone who can stand beside you, not someone who drags you down with my failures. Olivia's eyes softened slightly, but there was no warmth in them, just the remnants of the woman who had loved him so deeply, and the woman who had been betrayed by his choices. I don't know if I can forgive you, Jonathan, she whispered, the words heavy between them. I don't know if I can forget the years of neglect, the times when you put everything before me, before us. The truth of her words struck him like a blow. He had been so consumed by his ambition, by his desire to be the best, that he had lost sight of the one thing that mattered most, their love, their connection. He had taken her for granted, and now she was standing before him, a woman who had given everything, only to be met with his indifference. I don't expect you to forgive me, Jonathan said, his voice trembling. I don't expect everything to be fixed overnight, but I want you to know that I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for everything, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make this right. Olivia looked at him for a long time, her gaze steady, and Jonathan could see the conflict in her eyes. She was torn between the man she had once loved and the man who had hurt her so deeply. Between the life they had built and the life that was now slipping away, piece by piece. I need to see that you're willing to change, Jonathan, she said quietly, not just for me but for yourself. Because until you can truly face what you've done, I don't know if I can stay. Her words were like a knife in his chest, but they were also a wake-up call. He had spent so long living in the shadow of his past mistakes, so long hiding behind his wealth and power, that he had lost sight of the man he had once been. The man who had loved her fiercely without hesitation. The man who had promised to stand by her side, through thick and thin. I will change, Olivia, he said softly, his voice steady with resolve. I will prove it to you, but it's not going to be easy. And I can't do it alone. She looked at him, her eyes filled with sorrow and something else, something he couldn't quite name. She reached out, her fingers brushing his hand gently, a simple gesture that spoke volumes. I don't know if we can fix what's broken, Jonathan, she whispered, her voice barely audible. But I'm willing to try. As Jonathan sat there, his hand still resting on hers, he realized that this was the first real chance he had to make things right. It wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't happen overnight. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had a purpose again. It wasn't about the business or the power or the wealth. It was about her. And for Olivia, the woman who had been his everything, Jonathan knew that this was just the beginning. The road ahead would be long, filled with challenges and hard choices, but it was a road he was willing to walk. For her, for them, and most importantly, for himself. The next few days after Jonathan's conversation with Olivia were heavy with silence. The kind of silence that settles into every room, every conversation, making everything feel distant and unreal. Jonathan had promised to change. He had promised to be the man Olivia deserved, the man who could look beyond the success and see the life they had built together. But change, he was learning, didn't come easily. Not in his world of power, control, and isolation. Olivia had been distant since their talk. She was quieter now, and while her eyes still held a flicker of something, maybe hope, maybe caution, she wasn't ready to give herself fully to the idea of them again. And Jonathan couldn't blame her. He had given her so little for so long, but the weight of her hesitance was like a cloud that hung over him, a reminder that no matter how much he wanted things to be different, they wouldn't change overnight. And then there was Grace. Her words from their last meeting still lingered in Jonathan's mind. It's not about fixing what's broken, it's about rebuilding something new, something real. It was a concept he had barely begun to understand. Grace had set him on a path of self-examination, had held up a mirror to his flaws, but she had also made it clear that they could never go back to what they had. Too much time had passed, too many wounds had been inflicted. But he couldn't stop thinking about her, the memory of their connection, once so pure, so free, now felt like something impossible to reclaim. The thought of her pulled at him like gravity. He had lost Olivia. He knew that, or at least he felt like he was losing her more with each passing day. But Grace had given him a glimpse of what could have been, of what they might have built if he hadn't been so consumed by his own ambition. It was late in the evening when Jonathan found himself once again pacing the apartment, the loneliness of the vast space echoing around him. He had been putting off calling Grace again, but it seemed inevitable now. The ache of their unfinished conversation was something he couldn't ignore anymore. He reached for his phone, hesitated, then dialed her number. It rang once, twice, and then, unexpectedly, she picked up. Jonathan. Grace's voice was soft, warm, but there was something in it that reminded him of the distance between them. Grace, he said, swallowing the lump in his throat. I need to see you. There was a pause on the other end. Jonathan. I thought we agreed that we couldn't go back to what we were. I know, he said quickly. And I don't want to go back. But I need closure, Grace. I need to know if there's any way forward for me. For us. Her silence stretched long before she responded. You've changed, Jonathan. I can hear it in your voice, but you need to figure out who you are first. You need to find that man before you try to be anything for anyone else. The words cut through him like a knife. She wasn't wrong, and yet, he didn't know where to start. He had spent so many years hiding from himself, from the truth of his own failures that now, facing the broken pieces of his life, he wasn't sure where to begin. Please, Grace, he whispered. I'm lost. I don't know what to do. Another long pause. Then finally she spoke. I'll meet you tomorrow, she said. But Jonathan, this isn't about fixing things. You're not going to find answers in the past. You need to look forward. The line went quiet again, and Jonathan was left staring at his phone. It felt like a lifeline thrown to him, but he didn't know if he was ready to grab it. Grace was right, of course. This wasn't about the past. It couldn't be. But as much as he knew he needed to move forward, the weight of his choices, of the paths he had taken, still haunted him. The next afternoon, Jonathan met Grace at a small cafe on the edge of the city. It was quiet there, the hum of conversation and the clinking of coffee cups providing a backdrop to the tension between them. Grace was sitting at a corner table, her back straight, her eyes focused on her coffee as she waited for him. She looked the same, yet so different. Stronger, maybe. More at peace with herself. Jonathan walked up to her and sat down, the weight of his own guilt pulling at him. He had always admired Grace's ability to move forward, her strength in forging a life for herself. She had become the woman he had once thought he would share everything with. And now, as he sat across from her, he realized how far apart they had truly grown. "I know you didn't want me to call," he began, his voice low. "But I don't know how to move forward without understanding what happened, without understanding me." Grace raised an eyebrow, a small smile tugging at her lips, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You already know what happened, Jonathan. You pushed me away. You chose success over love, over us. And I had to let go because holding on was only hurting me." Her words were like a slap, but they were also the truth. He had chosen success. He had chosen to climb the ladder, to build something that looked impressive from the outside, but was empty at the core. "I was wrong," Jonathan whispered. "I was so caught up in everything else that I didn't see what was right in front of me, what I had with you." Grace's gaze softened, but there was a cool distance to her that made it clear they would never be the same. "I'm not angry with you anymore, Jonathan. I'm just not the same person I was when we were together. And I can't go back to that. Not for you, not for me." Jonathan swallowed hard. "So this is it then? There's no us anymore?" Grace looked at him for a long time, her eyes searching his face, as though she were weighing her words. "There's no going back, Jonathan. But that doesn't mean we can't have a future. Separate, but still with respect. I want you to find peace. But you have to find it for yourself." The pain of her words settled in his chest like a heavy weight. But he knew she was right. He had to find peace. He had to find his own way forward before he could be anything to anyone. "I understand," he said quietly. "And I don't want to ask for anything else, not from you, not from Olivia. I just need to figure out who I am and what I want to do with the time I have left." Grace nodded, her gaze softening just slightly. "Then start with that. Start with yourself." Jonathan watched her for a long moment, taking in the quiet strength in her eyes. She was right. It was time to stop running. It was time to rebuild, not just for her, not just for Olivia, but for himself. The week that followed his conversation with Grace was quieter than Jonathan had expected, though the silence was filled with tension, not peace. He spent the days in a haze trying to dive back into his work, but each conference call, each meeting, felt empty. The business world that had once fueled him, that had given him purpose, now seemed like a series of hollow gestures. The numbers and deals blurred into insignificance, as Jonathan realized that the man he had been, the man who lived for ambition and control, no longer existed. Instead, he found himself standing at the edge of a new life, but unsure of how to take the first step. He had promised Olivia that he was working on himself, promised her that he could change. But what did that really mean? He wasn't even sure who he was without his empire to define him, without the constant pressure to succeed. But it was in the quiet moments, those rare pockets of time when he wasn't consumed by work or lost in his thoughts, that the reality of what had happened began to sink in. He had lost Olivia, the woman who had been by his side for so long, the one who had shared every victory, every failure. She was slipping through his fingers. And no matter how many times he promised to change, no matter how much he tried to rebuild, he couldn't escape the fact that his actions had consequences. The walls between them had been built brick by brick, and now Jonathan was facing the harsh reality of what it took to tear them down. One afternoon, Jonathan found himself walking through the city, his feet carrying him aimlessly. He had been avoiding the penthouse for the past few hours, unable to face the emptiness that had settled there since Olivia's retreat. She wasn't gone physically, not yet at least, but the emotional distance between them felt like a vast chasm. It wasn't just that she had pulled away, it was that he had allowed it to happen. As he walked past the familiar streets of Manhattan, Jonathan's mind kept drifting back to Grace. Their conversation had been a catalyst, a moment where everything he had ignored for so long came rushing to the surface. She had been right about everything, about how he had hidden behind his success, about how he had lost sight of what really mattered. But what he hadn't realized until now was just how much he had lost in the process. It wasn't just Olivia, and it wasn't just Grace. It was himself. He paused by a small park, the sun beginning to dip low on the horizon, casting a soft glow over the city. The chill of autumn was settling in, the air crisp and full of possibility, and for the first time in a long while, Jonathan felt something shift within him. He wasn't ready to move on, not completely. But he had to move forward. He had to find a way to rebuild, not just with Olivia, but for himself. It wasn't until later that evening that Jonathan finally mustered the courage to face Olivia again. She was in the kitchen when he arrived home, the soft clink of glassware and the hum of the refrigerator, the only sounds in the apartment. She didn't look up when he entered, her back to him as she worked quietly. "Olivia," he said softly, his voice tentative. She turned, a flicker of surprise crossing her face before her expression softened. But even that softness seemed distant, as though a part of her had already closed off from him. "Jonathan," she replied, her voice even but lacking the warmth it once held. "We need to talk." He nodded, the knot in his stomach tightening. I know I've made a mess of things. But I'm trying, Olivia. I'm trying to be the man you deserve." She didn't respond immediately, and the silence between them grew thick with unspoken words. Jonathan watched as she wiped her hands on the dish towel, her movements slow, measured. The woman he had once known, the woman who had held his world together for so long, was now someone he didn't quite understand. "You keep saying that, Jonathan," Olivia said finally, her voice quiet but firm. "But actions speak louder than words. And so far, all I've seen are promises. Empty ones." The sting of her words hit him harder than he expected. She was right. He had promised her everything, and all he had given her in return were excuses and broken promises. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Jonathan said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away. But I'm trying to be someone I can respect, someone who can stand beside you, not behind you. I've spent so long hiding from myself, from you, from everything that really matters. But I can't keep doing that." Olivia's gaze softened slightly, but there was no warmth in it, just a sadness that seemed to have taken root deep within her. She stepped closer to him, her eyes searching his face as though trying to find some trace of the man she had once loved. "Do you even know who you are anymore, Jonathan?" she asked softly, her voice breaking with quiet pain. Jonathan stood still, the question hanging between them like a weight. "No," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't. But I'm trying to figure it out. For you, for me, for the life we once had." The silence that followed was heavy, but this time it didn't feel suffocating. For the first time in a long time, Jonathan felt like he was finally being honest with her, and with himself. "I don't know if I can trust you again," Olivia said, her voice quiet. "I don't know if I can ever feel the way I used to, not after everything that's happened. But I'm not ready to walk away yet, Jonathan. I'm not sure what this is, what we are, but I can't give up on it without knowing if you can change." Jonathan swallowed, his heart pounding in his chest. "I'm not asking for everything right now, Olivia, but I'm asking for a chance to show you who I really am." She nodded slowly, her eyes filled with uncertainty and something else. Hope, maybe, or just the faintest trace of the love they had once shared. "I don't know what will happen," Olivia said quietly, her voice full of doubt. "But we can't go back. and I don't think we can fix this in one conversation. But maybe we can start over." The tentative hope in her words felt like a lifeline thrown into the storm that had been their marriage. Jonathan wasn't sure what would happen next. He didn't know if they could ever return to what they once were. But in that moment, he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't willing to let go of her without a fight. The days after that conversation with Olivia stretched into something different. The air between them was still thick with unspoken words, but there was also a fragile thread of hope woven through the silence. They had stopped avoiding each other, but there was still a great deal of emotional distance between them. Jonathan found himself walking that delicate line between wanting to prove himself and fearing that he might fail her again. He spent his mornings working on the business, but his mind was never fully engaged. Every phone call, every strategy session, felt like a distraction from the real work he needed to do, the work of rebuilding. He had started therapy, trying to unpack the years of emotional neglect he had buried beneath the weight of ambition. He had also started spending more time with Olivia, not in the way he wanted, romantically, passionately, but in small, intimate moments, cooking dinner together, sharing quiet mornings over coffee, walking through the city with no particular destination. But there were still moments when the past crept in, when the weight of everything he had done hung heavy between them. Jonathan didn't know how long it would take for things to feel normal again, or if they ever would. The trust they once had was gone, fractured, and the road ahead was long and uncertain. It was a chilly Saturday afternoon when Jonathan decided to do something he hadn't done in months. He went out for a walk in the park. He hadn't walked through the city with Olivia in what felt like forever, and though he was afraid to ask, he had the faintest glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, she would join him. He had learned by now that small gestures, those quiet moments of connection, were the things that could begin to rebuild what had been broken. He texted her, his fingers trembling slightly as he typed. "Jonathan, I'm going to take a walk in the park. Would you like to join me?" He didn't expect an immediate reply, but when his phone buzzed a few minutes later, he almost didn't believe it. "Olivia, I'll meet you in 15 minutes. His heart skipped. Maybe this wasn't the end after all. Maybe there was a chance for them. When Olivia appeared, walking toward him with a quiet smile, Jonathan felt his breath catch. She looked the same as she always had, beautiful, elegant, but there was something different in the way she carried herself now, a kind of wariness, as though she was guarding herself against disappointment. Jonathan couldn't blame her. He had hurt her in ways he would never be able to undo. But still, here she was, walking toward him. He wasn't sure what to say, but the simple act of her presence felt like a balm for the ache in his chest. She had agreed to join him after all. It was a small step, but it was a step forward. "Hey," he said, his voice soft, almost tentative. "How's your day going?" She smiled, a little more warmly now. "Busy," she replied, her tone light. "But I needed the fresh air." They walked side by side, the noise of the city fading as they entered the park. The trees were beginning to shed their autumn leaves, the ground covered in a carpet of gold and brown. It was a beautiful afternoon, the kind that made everything feel just a little bit lighter. "I've been thinking a lot," Jonathan said after a while, his words slow, measured. "About us, about everything." Olivia didn't look at him immediately, but her stride slowed, as though she were listening intently. "You've been doing a lot of thinking lately," she said, her voice soft but serious. "I can tell." He nodded, a deep breath escaping him. "I know I haven't made it easy for you to believe in me again. I know I've let you down and I can't undo that. But I'm trying, Olivia. I'm trying to be the man I used to be. The man who didn't take you for granted. the man who loved you without hesitation. She turned to him then, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that made his heart race. "I know you're trying," she said quietly, "and I can see it, Jonathan. But I'm not sure if trying is enough anymore." Her words hit him harder than he expected. He had thought that with time, with enough effort, they could rebuild the love they had lost. But the truth in her eyes made him realize that it wasn't just about trying. It was about proving, slowly, that he had changed, that he was willing to face the consequences of his actions and give her something real. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away," he said, his voice thick. "I know I've made mistakes, and I know it will take time. But I need you to know that I'm here. For you, and for us, if you're willing to give me the chance." Olivia's eyes softened, but there was a sadness there, a quiet acceptance of the reality that things might never be the same between them. "I want to believe that, Jonathan," she said quietly. "I want to believe that we can find our way back. But I can't keep waiting for something that may never happen." Jonathan felt his heart tighten in his chest. The pain of her words, the fear of losing her completely, was almost unbearable. But in the same breath, he realized that this was what he had needed to hear. He couldn't continue to hold on to the illusion of what they had. The truth was, their love had changed, and he had to accept that. "I don't want to lose you," Jonathan said, his voice low, filled with vulnerability. "But I know I can't keep asking for something I'm not willing to give. I've been selfish, Olivia. I've been so caught up in what I thought was important that I forgot what you needed. And I don't know how to make it right, but I'm willing to try." They stopped walking then, standing on a small bridge overlooking the water, the late afternoon sunlight reflecting on the ripples below. Olivia stood there, looking out over the park, her arms crossed lightly over her chest. "I don't know where we go from here," she said softly. "I don't know if we can go back to the way things were. But I think we need to stop pretending that things can stay the same. I need to see if we can rebuild, but I'm not sure if I'm ready to fully trust again." Jonathan felt a wave of understanding wash over him. This wasn't about fixing everything in a single conversation or expecting things to return to what they once were. It was about small steps, about proving, day by day, that they could rebuild something new. And that rebuilding would start with him, not with grand gestures, but with simple honesty, with being present in the quiet moments, and with showing her, in his actions, that he was a man worthy of her trust. "I can't promise it will be easy," Jonathan said, his voice soft but steady. "But I can promise that I won't give up on you, Olivia. On us. I'll prove it, however long it takes." She turned to face him then, her eyes searching his face. For a moment, Jonathan felt that familiar warmth between them again. It was fragile, uncertain, but it was there, like a spark that could catch fire if they both allowed it. "I'm not asking for promises," Olivia said, her voice gentle. "But I'm willing to see where this goes. I'm willing to give you a chance, Jonathan. But you have to prove that you can be the man I need you to be." Jonathan nodded, the weight of her words settling into him. He didn't have all the answers. He didn't know what the future held. But for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was on the right path. He wasn't just trying to fix his marriage. He was trying to fix himself, and that, he realized, was the only way forward. The city outside the window had changed, or perhaps Jonathan had changed. Manhattan's skyline, once a symbol of his power, no longer held the same allure. Now the view from his penthouse felt quieter, more intimate, as if the city was listening, waiting for him to make the next move. The world around him still moved with its relentless pace, but Jonathan was no longer just a spectator. He had finally stepped off the treadmill of ambition that had driven him for so long, ready to face the person he had once neglected, himself. It had been several months since that afternoon in the park with Olivia, a day that had been a turning point for them both. Their relationship had slowly started to rebuild piece by piece, not because of grand gestures or promises made in desperation, but because they were both willing to face the truth. Jonathan wasn't the man he once was, and Olivia wasn't the woman who had blindly trusted him. But they were learning to see each other again, to rebuild from the brokenness. Jonathan had spent these months focusing on the small things, learning to listen, really listen, when Olivia spoke, taking responsibility for his past actions without expecting forgiveness on demand, and most importantly, learning to live without the constant need to prove himself through wealth or power. The pursuit of success had always been his armor, the way he shielded himself from vulnerability, from emotional intimacy. But now he was learning that true strength came from being open, from being present. It was a slow, painful process, but with every step forward, he felt more like the man he wanted to be. Olivia, too, had made progress. She had started to trust him again, though the trust wasn't the same as it once had been. It was cautious, careful, but real. Their relationship was not one of blind devotion anymore. It was built on respect, on the understanding that love, in its truest form, required work, and neither of them was willing to walk away from it. Jonathan had just returned from a meeting with his board when he received the text from Olivia. It had been a quiet day, the kind he was learning to appreciate. No urgent calls, no demands from clients, no expectations from the world. Just him, trying to figure out how to be present, how to show up in his own life. Olivia, dinner tonight, just us, no work, no distractions. A smile tugged at Jonathan's lips. She was still pushing him, still making sure he wasn't slipping back into old habits. But he didn't mind. He welcomed it now. The woman he had once taken for granted had become someone he truly admired, not just for her strength, but for the love she had given him even when he didn't deserve it. She had given him the hardest lesson of all, that love, true love, wasn't something to be earned through grand gestures. It was something to be cultivated, nurtured in the quiet moments between them. He quickly texted back, "Jonathan, looking forward to it, you and me, no distractions." That evening, as he set the table in their apartment, a simple, intimate meal, Jonathan reflected on how far they had come. There had been so many moments when he thought it was too late, when he believed the damage was irreparable. But here they were, together, ready to see what came next. They weren't fixed, not in the traditional sense, but they had found something better. Acceptance, understanding, and maybe, just maybe, love that was stronger than it had ever been before. Olivia entered the room, her smile genuine, her eyes warm but still guarded. She had always been beautiful, but now she radiated something more. She had forgiven him, but not because he asked for it. She had forgiven him because she had found the strength to do so, because she believed that people, he, could change. And Jonathan knew, deep down, that he would spend the rest of his life proving that she was right. "You look amazing," he said, his voice full of admiration. She laughed softly, the sound more familiar now than it had been in so long. "Not as amazing as this meal will be, I hope," she teased, her eyes glinting. Jonathan chuckled, setting the wine glasses down. "I'll let you be the judge of that." As they sat down to dinner, the conversation flowed easily between them, with no hidden agendas, no weighty silences. They talked about everything, the work they were both doing, the small victories, the future. There were no illusions anymore, no pretending that everything was perfect. But they didn't need perfection. What they had now was real. The meal ended with a glass of wine, and as Jonathan looked across the table at Olivia, he realized that this was enough. They weren't the people they had been when they first met, full of dreams and promises that came too easily. They had faced hardship, they had faced each other's flaws, and through it all, they had found something deeper, something lasting, a partnership, a love that had been tempered by time and truth. Olivia reached across the table, her fingers brushing his. "I'm proud of you," she said, her voice steady and warm. Jonathan squeezed her hand, feeling a sense of peace he had never known before. "I'm proud of us," he corrected her softly. "We've both come a long way." They sat there for a while, the soft hum of the city outside their window filling the silence between them. Jonathan realized that for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of what the future held. He didn't need the wealth, the status, or the power anymore. All he needed was this, the quiet certainty that he was becoming the man he wanted to be, not just for Olivia, but for himself. A few weeks later, Jonathan stood in front of the office building that had once been a symbol of his entire existence. It was just a building now, an empty structure where he had spent far too many years running from the things that truly mattered. He had made the decision to step down from his role as CEO to pass the reins to someone who could take the company in a new direction. It was the hardest decision of his life, but it was also the most freeing. As he walked out of the building for the last time, he felt lighter than he had in years. The weight of the world that had once been on his shoulders was gone, and in its place was a sense of possibility, of new beginnings. He didn't need to chase success anymore. He had everything he needed right here, with Olivia, with himself. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough.